From public humiliation in wooden stocks to being sawed alive while fully conscious, medieval Europe created punishments that transformed execution into calculated torture. These 15 methods reveal humanity's capacity for unimaginable cruelty. Sawing medieval executioners developed countless ways to end human life, but sawing stands apart as perhaps the most calculated act of cruelty ever designed. This execution method wasn't simply about death. Every aspect was engineered to maximize suffering and prolong consciousness for as long as anatomically possible. The condemned person was hanged completely upside down, with their legs spread apart, and firmly tied to 2 separate posts. 2 executioners would then take positions on either side, gripping a large 2-person saw. They would begin cutting the victim in half, vertically, starting from the groin and working slowly downward toward the head. The upside-down position served a specific and horrifying medical purpose. When a person hangs, inverted blood rushes directly to the brain, keeping it fully oxygenated and the victim completely conscious. This prevented the mercy of shock or rapid blood loss that would occur if someone were upright. Medieval executioners possessed enough anatomical knowledge to exploit this deliberately. Most victims remained awake and aware until the saw reached their abdomen or chest cavity. Some documented cases describe people screaming and conscious until the blade finally severed their diaphragm. The process could take anywhere from several minutes to over an hour, depending on how slowly the executioners worked. Medieval courts reserved sawing for crimes considered absolutely unforgivable, including murder, treason, adultery, and in many regions, homosexuality. The punishment was designed not just to kill, but to serve as the most terrifying possible deterrent to anyone witnessing the execution. Germany, Spain, and France employed sawing most frequently during the Inquisition period. Despite its extreme barbarity, historical records confirm this method continued in isolated regions well into the 18th century before finally being abandoned as societies slowly moved toward less torturous forms of capital punishment. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, this large wooden wagon wheel with heavy spokes, became synonymous with the absolute worst fate a criminal could face. The condemned person was tied spread-eagled to the wheel, with their limbs stretched out along the wooden spokes. 2 sturdy wooden beams were positioned beneath the wheel, creating gaps at strategic points. The executioner would then raise a heavy iron bar or sledgehammer and begin the systematic destruction of the victim's body. The process followed a deliberate pattern. Each limb received multiple crushing blows, starting at the extremities and working inward. The executioner would strike the bones over the gaps between the beams, ensuring maximum shattering impact. Ankles, shins, knees, thighs, wrists, forearms, elbows, and upper arms were methodically pulverized, one section at a time. More merciful sentences specified top-down execution, meaning the first blow would be to the neck, causing relatively quick death. But for the worst criminals, courts ordered bottom-up punishment. These unfortunate souls endured hours of bone-breaking agony, starting with their feet and slowly progressing upward through their entire body. After the breaking was complete, many victims were left alive on the wheel. Their shattered bodies were sometimes woven through the spokes in grotesque displays. The wheel would then be mounted on a tall pole in public squares, where the broken criminal would die slowly from shock, dehydration, or exposure over the course of days. Carrion birds often attacked while victims still lived. The rack, it stands as perhaps the most iconic torture device in medieval history, and its simplicity made it devastatingly effective. This wooden frame, with rollers at each end, became the centerpiece of countless interrogation chambers and torture dungeons throughout Europe, particularly in England, where it saw extensive use in the Tower of London. The victim was laid flat on their back on the wooden platform. Their wrists were bound with ropes attached to a roller at one end, while their ankles were similarly bound to a roller at the opposite end. The torturer would then begin turning a handle, slowly rotating the rollers in opposite directions. As the rollers turned, the ropes pulled the victim's limbs in opposing directions, creating unbearable tension throughout their entire body. The stretching began gradually, almost deceptively gentle at first, but as the torturer continued turning the handle, the tension increased exponentially. The victim's joints were the first to suffer. Shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees were pulled beyond their natural range of motion. Witnesses described hearing distinct popping sounds. As joints dislocated from their sockets, the ligaments connecting bones would stretch past their breaking point and snap with audible cracks that echoed through the torture chamber. The agony didn't stop there. Once the joints had separated, continued stretching would tear muscles, rip tendons, and eventually cause bones themselves to fracture. Victims often grew several inches longer during their time on the rack as their spines stretched and separated. Those who survived the rack rarely recovered fully. Their joints remained permanently damaged, leaving them unable to walk properly or use their arms. Many victims confessed to anything their torturers wanted simply to make the stretching stop, regardless of whether the confessions were true. Judas cradle. This device consisted of a tall, pyramid-shaped seat with an extremely sharp point at the top, mounted on a sturdy wooden or metal frame. The victim was stripped naked and positioned directly above the pyramid point, using a system of ropes and pulleys. Their hands were typically bound behind their back to prevent any attempt at protection or resistance. Then the torturer would slowly lower them down until the sharp pyramid tip pressed against either their anus or vagina. The torture operated on the principle of gradual pressure rather than immediate impalement. The victim's own body weight created constant downward force against the pyramid point. As hours passed, the pressure would slowly force the tip deeper into the body, tearing through tissue and muscle incrementally. Torturers could control the speed and intensity of the torture through several methods. Adding weights to the victim's legs increased the downward pressure significantly. Alternatively, they could lower the ropes slightly at intervals, forcing the pyramid deeper into the body in sudden, painful increments. The victim was rarely allowed to sleep during this torture. If they showed signs of losing consciousness, torturers would shake the ropes or add additional weight to jolt them awake. This sleep deprivation, combined with the constant pain, created a special kind of psychological breakdown. Most victims couldn't maintain their position and would slowly sink further onto the pyramid over days of torture. The resulting injuries were catastrophic. Torn muscles became infected in the filthy conditions of medieval dungeons. Even those who survived faced permanent internal damage that left them unable to control basic bodily functions for the rest of their lives. Rat torture. This method required minimal equipment but produced maximum horror, making it a favored technique during medieval interrogations and public punishments. The victim was restrained flat on their back, completely immobilized on a table or wooden platform. A metal cage or heavy iron pot was then placed directly on their bare abdomen or chest. Inside this container, the torturer placed several live rats, typically starved for days beforehand, to increase their desperation. The truly diabolical element came next. Hot coals or burning torches were applied to the top of the metal container, heating it gradually. As the metal grew hotter, the trapped rats inside began to panic. Rats possess powerful survival instincts and will do absolutely anything to escape danger, including unbearable heat. With the metal walls of their cage becoming increasingly hot and no escape route available upward or to the sides, the frantic rats discovered only one possible exit. They began clawing and gnawing downward through the softest available material, which happened to be the victim's flesh. The rats would tear through skin, burrow through muscle tissue, and sometimes even chew through the abdominal wall into the internal organs. Victims remained conscious through much of this process, feeling every scratch, bite, and tunneling movement as the panicked animals literally ate their way through living tissue to escape the heat. The psychological damage matched the physical horror. Knowing that living creatures were inside your body, moving around and consuming you from within, created a terror that broke even the strongest minds long before the physical injuries proved fatal. The breast ripper, this iron instrument, featured 4 sharp claws designed to tear through flesh with maximum damage, and it targeted the most sensitive parts of the female body. The device resembled a large iron spider with 4 curved, razor-sharp claws extending from a central grip. Executioners often heated the metal until it glowed red before applying it to the victim. The searing heat would burn the skin on contact before the real torture even began. The claws were positioned around a single breast and then clamped down, penetrating deep into the tissue. The torturer would then pull forcefully, literally ripping the breast away from the chest wall. The claws were designed to tear through skin, fat, muscle, and mammary tissue in the most damaging way possible, leaving massive open wounds. Women faced this punishment for numerous supposed crimes, including adultery, self-induced abortion, blasphemy, heresy, and any action considered sexually inappropriate by church or civil authorities. Unmarried mothers were particularly targeted. The public nature of this punishment added humiliation to the physical agony. Those who survived the initial torture faced severe complications. The massive wounds almost always became infected in medieval conditions, where basic hygiene and antibiotics didn't exist. Many victims died slowly from blood loss or septic shock in the days following the punishment. Some regions employed variations where both breasts were removed in succession. Executioners sometimes displayed the torn flesh publicly as a warning to other women. The breast ripper remained in documented use across Europe well into the 17th century before gradually falling out of favor. Hanged, drawn, and quartered England reserved this multi-stage execution specifically for men convicted of high treason, creating a punishment so elaborate and brutal that each phase inflicted its own unique form of agony. The process unfolded in carefully orchestrated steps, designed to maximize suffering while keeping the victim conscious as long as possible. The condemned man was first tied to a wooden hurdle or panel and dragged through the streets behind a horse to the execution site. This journey alone inflicted serious injuries as the victim bounced and scraped across cobblestones and rough terrain for miles. Upon arrival At the gallows, the executioner would hang the victim by the neck, but crucially, not long enough to cause death. The hanging lasted just until the point of near unconsciousness. Then the victim was cut down while still alive and aware. The third stage brought the worst horror. While the victim remained conscious, the executioner would slice open the abdomen and pull out the intestines and internal organs. These organs were then burned in a fire within the victim's sight, forcing them to watch their own body parts consumed by flames. The final stage involved beheading and quartering. After the victim finally died from the disembowelment, the executioner would sever the head and then hack the body into 4 separate pieces. These body parts were typically displayed on spikes at different locations throughout the kingdom as warnings. The most famous victims of this punishment included William Wallace, the Scottish resistance leader, and the gunpowder plot conspirators. The practice continued in England until 1870, though by then the hanging portion was allowed to cause death before the other stages commenced, making it marginally less barbaric. The pair of anguish, this small metal device, inflicted internal injuries so severe that victims rarely survived, and those who did faced permanent mutilation. The pair of anguish measured only about 3 to 4 inches long, but its compact size belied its devastating capability. The device consisted of 4 metal leaves, or petals, joined together in a pear shape with a screw mechanism running through the center. When closed, it appeared deceptively small and harmless. The screw at the top allowed the torturer to gradually force the 4 leaves apart, expanding the device to several times its original size. Different versions existed for different victims and different alleged crimes. The oral pair punished liars and blasphemers. The vaginal pair targeted women accused of adultery, having relations with Satan, or inducing their own miscarriages. The rectal pair punished men accused of homosexuality, which medieval courts considered among the gravest sins. The torturer would insert the closed device into the victim's mouth, vagina, or anus, then begin slowly turning the screw. As the mechanism activated, the 4 metal leaves gradually separated from each other, expanding inside the body cavity. The sharp edges of the leaves would tear through delicate internal tissue as they spread. Torturers could control how far the device expanded. A partial opening caused pain, and internal tearing caused agonizing pain without immediate death. Full expansion resulted in catastrophic internal injuries that ripped through organs and caused massive internal bleeding. Victims who survived the immediate torture faced infections that almost always proved fatal in medieval conditions. The internal damage was so severe that even basic bodily functions became impossible. The pair of anguish appeared throughout Europe from the 14th through the 18th centuries, particularly during religious inquisitions targeting heretics and those accused of sexual transgressions. Boiling alive, boiling represented one of the slowest and most merciless death sentences medieval courts could impose. The condemned person faced gradual immersion in a massive vat filled with water, oil, tar, or even molten lead, depending on what authorities wanted to achieve with the execution. 2 distinct methods existed, each horrifying in its own way. The first involved placing the victim into already boiling liquid, causing immediate and catastrophic burns across the entire body. The second method proved even more cruel. The victim would be placed into cool liquid, and then fires beneath the vat would slowly bring the temperature up to boiling. This gradual heating meant the victim remained conscious and aware as the water temperature climbed degree by degree. They could feel their skin beginning to redden, then blister, then eventually cook away from their bones. The process could take over an hour before the victim finally succumbed. Medieval courts employed boiling primarily for poisoners and counterfeiters. The reasoning followed a twisted logic that the punishment should mirror the crime. Poisoners who contaminated food or drink would die by contaminated liquid. Counterfeiters who melted metals to make false coins would be melted themselves. England formally legalized boiling as an execution method under King Henry VIII in 1531. The law remained on the books for 15 years. Several documented executions occurred during this period, including a cook named Richard Roos, who was boiled at Smithfield for poisoning his employer's family. Witnesses described the screams as unbearable and the smell of cooking flesh as overwhelming. The victim's skin would literally fall away from the body as it boiled. Flaying it required exceptional skill from the executioner because the goal was removing the skin while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. This ancient practice continued throughout medieval Europe as punishment for crimes including treason, murder, and acts against the church or monarchy. The executioner would begin by making careful incisions at specific points on the body, typically starting at the face, chest, or limbs. Sharp knives designed specifically for this purpose would slice through only the top layers of skin without cutting into the muscle beneath. Once the initial cuts were made, the executioner would grip the edges of skin and begin peeling it away from the underlying tissue. The process resembled removing the peel from fruit, except the fruit was conscious and screaming. Starting from a central point, the executioner would work methodically across the body, separating skin from muscle inch by inch. Skilled executioners could remove skin from large sections of the body before the victim died from shock or blood loss. The face, back, chest, and limbs were typically targeted. Some historical accounts describe victims remaining alive and conscious even after having the skin removed from their entire torso. The exposed muscle tissue and nerves created pain beyond comprehension. Every movement, every breath, every slight touch against the raw flesh triggered waves of agony. The body's natural cooling mechanisms failed without skin, causing additional suffering as the victim's temperature became impossible to regulate. Those who somehow survived the initial flaying rarely lived long afterwards. Massive fluid loss, infection, and organ failure claimed victims within hours or days. Medieval courts sometimes preserved the removed skin, displaying it publicly or even using it to bind books as a permanent warning about the consequences of serious crimes. 5. The brazen bull. Ancient Greece invented the brazen bull, but medieval Europe enthusiastically adopted this device that transformed execution into theatrical spectacle. The apparatus consisted of a life-sized hollow bronze or brass bull with a door in its side and an intricate acoustic system built into its head. The condemned person was forced inside the metal bull through the side door, which was then locked and sealed shut. Executioners would build a massive fire beneath the bronze structure, gradually heating the metal from the outside. The victim trapped inside would essentially be roasted alive as the temperature climbed higher and higher. Bronze conducts heat extraordinarily well, meaning the interior temperature rose rapidly once the fire reached full intensity. The victim would experience burns covering their entire body simultaneously as the metal walls became searingly hot. There was no escape, no relief, and nowhere inside the bull that wasn't being heated to unbearable temperatures. The acoustic system built into the bull's head served a particularly twisted purpose. As the victim screamed in agony, the sound would travel through tubes and chambers designed to distort and amplify their cries. To spectators outside, the screams would emerge from the bull's mouth, sounding like the bellowing of an actual bull. This acoustic manipulation served two purposes. It dehumanized the victim by transforming their human suffering into animal sounds. It also created an entertaining spectacle for the crowds who gathered to watch executions, making the punishment more memorable and therefore more effective as a deterrent. Death inside the brazen bull came from a combination of factors, including severe burns, heat stroke, dehydration, and eventually suffocation as the superheated air became impossible to breathe. The process typically lasted 30 minutes to over an hour, depending on fire intensity. The iron chair transformed, sitting into an instrument of slow torture through hundreds of sharp metal spikes protruding from every surface. This device appeared throughout medieval Europe under various names, including the Judas chair and the Chinese torture chair, though its design remained consistently brutal across regions. The chair itself was constructed entirely from iron, with spikes covering the seat, backrests, armrests, leg rests, and even footrests. These spikes varied in length from half an inch to several inches, depending on the intended severity of punishment. Some versions featured over 500 individual spikes positioned to penetrate flesh at multiple points simultaneously. The victim was forced to sit on the chair, while executioners secured heavy iron straps across their chest, arms, thighs, and ankles. These straps would be gradually tightened using screw mechanisms, pressing the victim's body weight harder and harder against the protruding spikes. As the straps tightened, the spikes penetrated deeper into the flesh. What began as painful pressure transformed into hundreds of simultaneous puncture wounds across the entire body. The victim couldn't shift position or relieve pressure from any area because movement only drove different spikes deeper into their flesh. Many versions of the iron chair included heating elements. Executioners would place burning coals beneath or around the chair, heating the metal until it seared the victim's skin while the spikes continued penetrating deeper. This combination of burning, piercing, and crushing created layers of agony that overwhelmed the senses. Sessions on the iron chair could last hours or even days. Torturers would periodically tighten the straps further or add more heat to maintain maximum pain levels. Victims rarely died directly from the chair itself, but rather from infections that developed in the numerous puncture wounds afterward. The Scold's Bridle Medieval Society created the Scold's Bridle specifically to punish women deemed too outspoken, argumentative, or disobedient to their husbands. This iron cage fitted completely around the head with a metal bit that forced its way into the mouth and pressed down hard on the tongue. The iron framework enclosed the entire skull, making removal impossible without a key. The mouthpiece featured a flat metal plate covered in sharp spikes or a rough wire-like surface that pressed directly onto the tongue. Any attempt to move the tongue, speak, or swallow caused the spikes to dig deeper into the sensitive tissue. Women were forced to wear this device for hours or entire days as public punishment. Authorities would parade them through town squares and marketplaces, while crowds jeered and threw garbage. The humiliation was intentional and complete. The tongue piece caused severe damage during extended wear. Constant pressure from the metal created deep cuts and abrasions. Many women suffered permanent speech impediments after removal. Some versions included additional spikes positioned to pierce the cheeks or roof of the mouth if the victim struggled. The scold's bridle remained legal in parts of Europe and even colonial America well into the 18th century. It represented medieval society's extreme measures to silence and control women who challenged male authority or simply spoke too freely. The ducking stool, it served as both torture device and a test for suspected witches throughout medieval Europe. This contraption consisted of a chair or cage attached to a long wooden beam that operated like a seesaw, positioned over a river, pond, or water-filled pit. The accused woman was strapped tightly into the chair with no possibility of escape. Operators would then pull a lever or rope, plunging the entire chair underwater with the victim still bound inside. The duration of submersion varied based on the severity of accusations and the mood of authorities. For suspected witches, the ducking stool operated on twisted logic. If the woman drowned, she was innocent but dead. If she somehow survived multiple submersions, this proved she possessed supernatural powers and was therefore guilty of witchcraft, leading to execution by other means. The repeated plunging created panic and terror as victims desperately held their breath underwater, never knowing how long the submersion would last. Water would rush into their nose and mouth. Lungs would burn for oxygen. Each time they surfaced, gasping and choking, they had only seconds to breathe before being plunged under again. Many women died not from drowning, but from shock, hypothermia, or heart failure during the ordeal. Others suffered permanent lung damage from aspirating water during the repeated dunkings. The stocks and pillory, it secured the ankles while victims sat, and the pillory locked the head and hands while victims stood upright in public squares. Minor offenses landed people in these devices, including drunkenness, petty theft, selling underweight bread, or gossiping. Punishments typically lasted several hours to a few days, depending on the crime. The real punishment came from public exposure. Townspeople would gather to mock, insult, and throw rotten vegetables, spoiled food, mud, and animal waste at the trapped victims. Being pelted with garbage for hours was humiliating but rarely dangerous. Occasionally, the crowds became violent, throwing rocks or heavier objects that could cause injuries. Some victims died from dehydration or exposure during extended sentences in extreme weather. But compared to the horrific tortures and executions throughout medieval Europe, spending time in the stocks was considered merciful. This concludes our countdown of the 15 most disturbing punishments used in medieval Europe.